Chapter 17 of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Panther's Paw. Evening came, and still they had not sighted the outlaws. As dark fell, they drew near a house snuggled away among a group of cottonwoods. Here they determined to spend the night, for Calder's pony was now almost exhausted. A man of 50 came from the house in answer to their call, and showed them the way to the horse shed. While they unsaddled their horses, he told them his name was Sam Daniels, and yet he evinced no curiosity as to the identity of his guests, and they volunteered no information. His eyes lingered long and fondly over the exquisite lines of Satan. From behind, from the side, and in front, he viewed the stallion, while Dan rubbed down the legs of his mount with a care which was most foreign to the ranges. Finally the cattleman reached out a hand toward the smoothly muscled shoulders. It was Calder who stood nearest, and he managed to strike up Daniels' extended arm and jerk him back from the region of danger. "What in the hell's that for?" exclaimed Daniels. "That horse is called Satan," said Calder, "and when anyone save his owner touches him, he lives up to his name and raises hell." Before Daniels could answer, the light of his lantern fell upon Black Bart, hitherto half hidden by the deepening shadows of the night, but standing now at the entrance of the shed. The cattleman's teeth clicked together, and he slapped his hand against his thigh and reached for a gun which was not there. "Look behind you," he said to Calder. "A wolf." He made a grab for the marshal's gun, but the latter forestalled him. "Go easy, partner," he said, grinning. "That's only the running mate of the horse. He's not a wolf, at least not according to his owner, and as for being wild, look at that." Bart had stalked calmly into the shed and now lay curled up exactly beneath the feet of the stallion. The two guests received a warmer welcome from Sam Daniels' wife when they reached the house. Their son Buck had been expected home for supper, but it was too late for them to delay the meal any longer. Accordingly they sat down at once, and the dinner was nearly over when Buck, having announced himself with a whoop as he rode up, entered, banging the door loudly behind him. He greeted the strangers with a careless wave of the hand and sat down at the table. His mother placed food silently before him. No explanations of his tardiness were asked, and none were offered. The attitude of his father indicated clearly that the boy represented the earning power of the family. He was a big fellow with broad, thick wrists and a straight black eye. When he had eaten, he broke into breezy conversation, and especially of a vicious mustang he had ridden on a bet the day before. "Speaking of hosses, Buck," said his father, "there's a black out in the shed right now that'd make your eyes just naturally pop out of their sockets. No more'n 15 hands, but a regular picture. Must be greased lightning." "I've heard talk of these streaks of greased lightning," said Buck, with a touch of scorn, "but I'll stack old Mike against the best of 'em. And there's a dog along with the hoss, a dog that's nearest to a wolf of any I ever seen." There was a sudden change in Buck, a change to be sensed rather than definitely noted with the eye. It was a stiffening of his body, an alertness of which he was at pains to make no show. For almost immediately he began to whistle softly, idly, his eyes roving carelessly across the wall while he tilted back in his chair. Dan dropped his hand close to the butt of his gun. Instantly the eyes of Buck flashed down and centered on Dan for an instant of keen scrutiny. Certainly Buck had connected the mention of the black horse and the wolf dog with a disturbing idea. When they went to their room, a room in which there was no bed and they had to roll down their blankets on the floor, Dan opened the window and commenced to whistle one of his own wild tunes. It seemed to Calder that there was a break in that music here and there, and a few notes grouped together like a call. In a moment a shadowy figure leaped through the window, and Black Bart landed on the floor with soft padding feet. Recovering from his start, Calder cursed softly. "What's the main idea?" he asked. Dan made a signal for a lower tone. "There ain't no idea," he answered. "But these Daniels people, do you know anything about them?" "No. Why?" "They interest me, that's all." "Anything wrong?" "I guess not." Why did you whistle for this infernal wolf? It makes me nervous to have him around. Get out, Bart." The wolf turned a languid eye upon the marshal. "Let him be," said Dan. "I don't feel no ways natural without having Bart around." The marshal made no further objections, and having rolled himself in his blankets was almost immediately asleep and breathing heavily. The moment Dan heard his companion draw breath with a telltale regularity, he sat up again in his blankets. Bart was instantly at his side. He patted the shaggy head lightly and pointed towards the door. "Guard," he whispered. Then he lay down and was immediately asleep. Bart crouched at his feet with his head pointed directly at the door. In other rooms there was the sound of the Daniels family going to bed, noises distinctly heard throughout the flimsy frame of the house. After that a deep silence fell which lasted many hours, but in that darkest moment which just precedes the dawn, a light creaking came up the hall. It was very faint, and it occurred only at long intervals. But at the first sound Black Bart raised his head from his paws and stared at the door with those glowing eyes which see in the dark. Now another sound came, still soft, regular. There was a movement of the door. In the pitch dark a man could never have noticed it, but it was plainly visible to the wolf. Still more visible, when the door finally stood wide, was the form of a man who stood in the opening. In one hand he carried a lantern thoroughly hooded, but not so well wrapped that it kept back a single ray which flashed on a revolver. The intruder made a step forward, a step as light as the fall of feathers, but it was not half so stealthy as the movement of Black Bart as he slunk towards the door. He had been warned to watch the door, but it did not need a warning to tell him that a danger was approaching the sleeping master. In the crouched form of the man, in the cautious step, he recognized the unmistakable stalking of one who hunts. Another soft step the man made forward. Then, with appalling suddenness, a blacker shadow shot up from the deep night of the floor, and white teeth gleamed before the stranger's face. He threw up his hand to save his throat. The teeth sank into his arm. A driving weight hurled him against the wall and then to the floor. The revolver and the lantern dropped clattering, and the latter, rolling from its wrappings, flooded the room with light. But neither man nor wolf uttered a sound. Calder was standing, gun in hand, but too bewildered to act, while Dan, as if he were playing a part long rehearsed, stood covering the fallen form of Buck Daniels. "Stand back from him, Bart," he commanded. The wolf slipped off a pace, whining with horrible eagerness, for he had tasted blood. Far away a shout came from Sam Daniels. Dan lowered his gun. "Stand up," he ordered. The big fellow picked himself up and stood against the wall with the blood streaming down his right arm. Still he said nothing, and his keen eyes darted from Calder to Whistlin Dan. "Give me a strip of that old shirt over there, will you, Tex?" said Dan, "and keep him covered while I tie up his arm." Before Calder could move, old Daniels appeared at the door, a heavy Colt in his hand. For a moment he stood dumbfounded, but then, with a cry, jerked up his gun, a quick movement, but a fraction of a second too slow, for the hand of Dan reached out and his knuckles struck the wrist of the old cattleman. The Colt rattled on the floor. He lunged after his weapon, but the voice of Buck stopped him short. "The game's up, Dad," he growled. "That older fella is Tex Calder." The name, like a blow in the face, straightened old Daniels and left him white and blinking. Whistlin Dan turned his back on the father and deftly bound up the lacerated arm of Buck. "In the name of God, Buck," moaned Sam, "what you been trying to do in here?" "What you'd do if you had the guts for it. That's Tex Calder and this is Dan Barry. They're on the trail of Big Jim. I wanted to put 'em off that trail." "Look here," said Calder, "how'd you know us?" "I've said my little say," said Buck sullenly, "and you'll get no more out of me between here and any hell you can take me to." "He knew us when his father talked about Satan and Black Bart," said Dan to Tex. "Maybe he's one of Silent's." "Buck, for God's sake, tell him you know nothing of Silent," cried old Daniels. Boy, it's hanging for you if they get you to Elkhead and charge you with that." "Dad, you're a fool," said Buck. "I ain't going down on my knees to him. Not me." Calder, still keeping Buck covered with his gun, drew Dan a little to one side. "What can we do with this feller, Dan?" he said. "Shall we give up the trail and take him over to Elkhead?" "And break the heart of the old man?" "Buck is one of the gang, that's certain." "Get Silent and there won't be no gang left." "But we caught this chap in red blood." "He ain't very old, Tex. Maybe he could change. I think he ain't been playing Silent's game any too long." "We can't let him go. It isn't in reason to do that." "I ain't thinkin' of reason. I'm thinkin' of old Sam and his wife." "And if we turn him loose?" "He'll be your man till he dies." Calder scowled. "The whole range is filled with these silent partners of the outlaws. But maybe you're right, Dan. Look at them now." The father was standing close to his son and pouring out a torrent of appeal, evidently begging him in a low voice to disavow any knowledge of Silent and his crew. But Buck shook his head sullenly. He had given up hope. Calder approached them. "Buck," he said, "I suppose you know that you could be hung for what you've tried to do tonight. If the law wouldn't hang you, a lynchin' party would. No jail would be strong enough to keep them away from you." Buck was silent, dogged. "But suppose we were to let you go scot free?" Buck started. A great flush covered his face. "I'm taking the advice of Dan Barry in doing this," said Calder. "Barry thinks you could go straight. Tell me, man to man, if I give you the chance, will you break loose from Silent and his gang?" A moment before Buck had been steeled for the worst, but this sudden change loosened all the bonds of his pride. He stammered and choked. Calder turned abruptly away. "Dan," he said, "here's the dawn, and it's time for us to hit the trail." They rolled their blankets hastily and broke away from the gratitude which poured like water from the heart of old Sam. They were in their saddles when Buck came beside Dan. His pride, his shame, and his gratitude broke his voice. "I ain't much on words," he said, "but it's you I'm thankin'." His hand reached up hesitatingly, and Dan caught it in a firm grip. "Why," he said gently, "even Satan here stumbles now and then, but that ain't no reason I should get rid of him. Good luck, partner." He shook the reins and the stallion leaped off after Calder's trotting pony. Buck Daniels stood motionless, looking after them, and his eyes were very dim. For an hour Dan and Tex were on the road before the sun looked over the hills. Calder halted his horse to watch. "Dan," he said at last, "I used to think there were only two ways of handling men, one with the velvet touch and one with the touch of steel. Mine has been the way of steel, but I begin to see that there's a third possibility, the touch of the panther's paw, the velvet with the steel claws hid beneath. That's your way, and I wonder if it isn't the best. I think Buck Daniels would be glad to die for you." He turned directly to Dan. "But all this is aside from the point, which is that the whole country is full of these silent partners of the outlaws. The law plays a lone hand in the mountain desert." "You've played the lone hand and won 20 times," said Dan. "Aye, but the 21st time I may fail. The difference between success and failure in this country is just the length of time it takes to pull a trigger. And Silent is fast with a gun. He's the root of the outlaw power. We may kill 100 men, but till he's gone we've only mowed the weeds, not pulled them. But what's the use of talking? 1 second will tell the tale when I stand face to face with Jim Silent and we go for our 6 guns. And somewhere between that rising sun and those mountains I'll find Jim Silent and the end of things for one of us." He started his cattle pony into a sudden gallop, and they drove on into the bright morning. End of chapter 17. Of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cain. Hardly a score of miles away, Jim Silent and his 6 companions topped a hill. He raised his hands and the others drew rein beside him. Kate Cumberland shifted her weight a little to one side of the saddle to rest and looked down from the crest on the sweep of country below. A mile away the railroad made a streak of silver light across the brown range, and directly before them stood the squat station house with red-tiled roof. Just before the house, a slightly broader streak of that gleaming light showed the position of the siding rails. She turned her head towards the outlaws. They were listening to the final directions of their chief, and the darkly intent faces told their own story. She knew from what she had gathered of their casual hints that this was to be the scene of the train holdup. It seemed impossible that this little group of men could hold that great fabric of a train with all its scores of passengers at their mercy. In spite of herself, half her heart wished them success. There was Terry Jordan, forgetful of the wound in his arm. Shorty Rhinehart, his saturnine face longer and more calamitous than ever. Hal Purvis grinning and nodding his head. Bill Kilduff with his heavy jaw set like a bulldog's. Lee Haynes with a lock of tawny hair blowing over his forehead, smiling faintly as he listened to Silent as if he heard a girl tell a story of love. And finally Jim Silent himself, huge, solemn, confident. She began to feel that these 6 men were worth 600. She hated them for some reasons, she feared them for others, but the brave blood of Joe Cumberland was thick in her, and she loved the danger of the coming moment. Their plans were finally agreed upon, their masks arranged, and after Haynes had tied a similar visor over Kate's face, they started down the hill at a swinging gallop. In front of the house of the station agent they drew up, and while the others were at their horses, Lee Haynes dismounted and rapped loudly at the door. It was opened by a gray bearded man smoking a pipe. Haynes covered him. He tossed up his hands and the pipe dropped from his mouth. "Who's in the house here with you?" asked Haynes. "Not a soul," stammered the man. "If you're looking for money, and you can run through the house, you won't find a thing worth taking." "I don't want your money, I want you," said Haynes, and immediately explained, "You're perfectly safe. All you have to do is be obliging. As for the money, you just throw open that switch and flag the train when she rolls along in a few moments. We'll take care of the rest. You don't have to keep your hands up." The hands came down slowly. For a brief instant the agent surveyed Haynes and the group of masked men who sat their horses a few paces away, and then without a word he picked up his flag from behind the door and walked out of the house. Throughout the affair he never uttered a syllable. Haynes walked up to the head of the siding with him while he opened the switch, and accompanied him back to the point opposite the station house to see that he gave the stop signal correctly. In the meantime 2 of the other outlaws entered the little station, bound the telegrapher hand and foot, and shattered his instrument. That would prevent the sending of any call for help after the holdup. Purvis and Jordan, since Terry could shoot with his left hand in case of need, went to the other side of the track and lay down against the grade. It was their business to open fire on the tops of the windows as the train drew to a stop. That would keep the passengers inside. The other 4 were distributed along the side nearest to the station house. Shorty Rhinehart and Bill Kilduff were to see that no passengers broke out from the train and attempted a flank attack. Haynes would attend to having the firebox of the engine flooded. For the cracking of the safe, Silent carried the stick of dynamite. Now the long wait began. There is a dreamlike quality about bright mornings in the open country, and everything seemed unreal to Kate. It was impossible that tragedy should come on such a day. The moments stole on. She saw Silent glance twice at his watch and scowl. Evidently the train was late, and possibly they would give up the attempt. Then a light humming caught her ear. She held her breath and listened again. It was unmistakable. A slight thing, a tremor to be felt rather than heard. She saw Haynes peering under shaded eyes far down the track, and, following the direction of his gaze, she saw a tiny spot of haze on the horizon. The tiny puff of smoke developed to a deeper, louder note. The station agent took his place on the track. Now the train bulked big, the engine wavering slightly to the unevenness of the roadbed. The flag of the station agent moved. Kate closed her eyes and set her teeth. There was a rumbling and puffing, and a mighty grinding, a shout somewhere, the rattle of a score of pistol shots. She opened her eyes to see the train rolling to a stop on the siding directly before her. Kilduff and Shorty Rhinehart, crouching against the grade, were splintering the windows one by one with nicely placed shots. The baggage cars were farther up the siding than Silent calculated. He and Haynes now ran towards the head of the train. The fireman and engineer jumped from their cab, holding their arms stiffly above their heads, and Haynes approached with a poised revolver to make them flood the firebox. In this way the train would be delayed for some time, and before it could send out the alarm the bandits would be far from pursuit. Haynes had already reached the locomotive, and Silent was running towards the first baggage car, when the door of that car slid open, and at the entrance appeared two men with rifles at their shoulders. As they opened fire, Silent pitched to the ground. Kate set her teeth and forced her eyes to stay open. Even as the outlaw fell, his revolver spoke, and one of the men threw up his hands with a yell and pitched out of the open door. His companion still kept his post, pumping shots at the prone figure. Twice more the muzzle of Silent's gun jerked up, and the second man crumpled on the floor of the car. A great hissing and jetting cloud of steam announced that Haynes had succeeded in flooding the firebox. Silent climbed into the first baggage car, stepping as he did so on the limp body of the Wells Fargo agent who lay on the roadbed. A moment later he flung out the body of the second messenger. The man flopped on the ground heavily, face downwards, and then, greatest horror of all, dragged himself to his hands and knees and began to crawl laboriously. Kate ran and dropped to her knees beside him. "Are you hurt badly?" she pleaded. Where?" He sagged to the ground and lay on his left side, breathing heavily. "Where is the wound?" she repeated. He attempted to speak, but only a bloody froth came to his lips. That was sufficient to tell her that he had been shot through the lungs. She tore open his shirt and found two purple spots high on the chest, one to the right and one to the left. From that on the left ran a tiny trickle of blood, but that on the right was only a small puncture in the midst of a bruise. He was far past all help. "Speak to me," she pleaded. His eyes rolled and then checked on her face. "Done for," he said in a horrible whisper. "That devil done me. Kid, cut out this life. I've played this game myself, and now I'm going to hell for it." A great convulsion twisted his face. "What can I do?" cried Kate. "Tell the world I died game." His body writhed, and in the last agony his hand closed hard over hers. It was like a silent farewell, that strong clasp. A great hand caught her by the shoulder and jerked her to her feet. "The charge is going off. Jump for it!" shouted Silent in her ear. She sprang up, and at the same time there was a great boom from within the car. The side bulged out, a section of the top lifted and fell back with a crash, and Silent ran back into the smoke. Haynes, Purvis, and Kilduff were instantly at the car, taking the ponderous little canvas sacks of coin as their chief handed them out. Within 2 minutes after the explosion 10 small sacks were deposited in the saddlebags on the horses which stood before the station house. Silent's whistle called in Terry Jordan and Shorty Rhinehart. A sharp order forced Kate to climb into her saddle, and the train robbers struck up the hillside at a racing pace. A confused shouting rose behind them. Rifles commenced to crack where some of the passengers had taken up the weapons of the dead guards. But the bullets flew wide, and the little troop was soon safely out of range. On the other side of the hilltop they changed their course to the right. For half an hour the killing pace continued, and then, as there was not a sign of immediate chase, the lone riders drew down to a soberer pace. Silent called, "Keep bunched behind me. We're headed for the old Salton place and a long rest." End of chapter 18. Of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Real Men. Some people pointed out that Sheriff Gus Morris had never made a single important arrest in the 10 years during which he had held office, and there were a few slanderers who spoke insinuatingly of the manner in which the lone riders flourished in Morris's domain. These knockers, however, were voted down by the vast majority, who swore that the sheriff was the finest fellow who ever threw a leg over saddle. They liked him for his inexhaustible good nature, the mellow baritone in which he sang the range songs at anyone's request, and perhaps, more than all, for the very laxness with which he conducted his work. They had had enough of the old school of sheriffs who lived a few months gun in hand and died fighting from the saddle. The office had never seemed desirable until Gus Morris ran for it and smiled his way to a triumphant election. Before his career as an office holder began, he ran a combined general merchandise store, saloon, and hotel. That is to say, he ran the hostelry in name. The real executive head, general manager, clerk, bookkeeper, and cook, and sometimes even bartender, was his daughter, Jacqueline. She found the place only a saloon, and a poorly patronized one at that. Her unaided energy gradually made it into a hotel, restaurant, and store. Even while her father was in office, he spent most of his time around the hotel. But no matter how important he might be elsewhere, in his own house he had no voice. There the only law was the will of Jacqueline. Out of the stable behind the hostelry, Dan and Tex Calder walked on the evening of the train robbery. They had reached the place of the hold-up a full 2 hours after Silent's crew departed, and the fireman and engineer had been working frantically during the interim to clean out the soaked firebox and get up steam again. Tex looked at the 2 dead bodies, spoke to the conductor, and then cut short the voluble explanations of a score of passengers by turning his horse and riding away, followed by Dan. All that day he was gloomily silent. It was a shrewd blow at his reputation, for the outlaws had actually carried out the robbery while he was on their trail. Not till they came out of the horse shed after stabling their horses did he speak freely. "Dan," he said, "do you know anything about Sheriff Gus Morris?" "No." "Then listen to this and salt every word away. I'm an officer of the law, but I won't tell that to Morris. I hope he doesn't know me. If he does, it will spoil our game. I'm almost certain he is playing a close hand with the lone riders. I'll wager he'd rather see a stick of dynamite than a marshal. Remember, when we get into that place, that we're not after Jim Silent or anyone else. We're simply traveling cowboys. No questions. I expect to learn something about the location of Silent's gang while we're here, but we'll never find out except by hints and chance remarks. We have to watch Morris like hawks. If he suspects us, he'll find a way to let Silent know we're here, and then the hunters will be hunted." In the house they found a dozen cattlemen sitting down at the table in the dining room. As they entered the room, the sheriff, who sat at the head of the table, waved his hand to them. "How are you, boys?" he called. "You'll find a couple of chairs right in the next room. Get 2 extra plates, Jack." As Dan followed Tex after the chairs, he noticed the sheriff beckon to one of the men who sat near him. As they returned with the chairs, someone was leaving the room by another door. "Tex," he said as they sat down side by side, "when we left the dining room for the chairs, the sheriff spoke to one of the boys, and as we came back, one of them was leaving through another door. Do you think Morris knew you when you came in?" Calder frowned thoughtfully and then shook his head. "No," he said in a low voice. "I watched him like a hawk when we entered. He didn't bat an eye when he saw me. If he'd recognized me, he's the greatest actor in the world, bar none. No, Dan, he doesn't know us from Adam and Abel." "All right," said Dan, "but I don't like something about this place. Maybe it's the smell of the air. Tex, take my advice and keep your gun ready for the fastest draw you ever made." "Don't worry about me," smiled Calder. "How about yourself?" "Hello," broke in Jacqueline from the end of the table. "Look who we've picked in the draw." Her voice was musical, but her accent and manner were those of a girl who has lived all her life among men and has caught their ways, with an exaggeration of that self-confidence which a woman always feels among Western men. Her blue eyes were upon Dan. "Ain't you a long ways from home?" she went on. The rest of the table, perceiving the drift of her badgering, broke into a rumbling bass chuckle. "Quite a ways," said Dan, and his wide brown eyes looked seriously back at her. A yell of delight came from the men at his naive rejoinder. Dan looked about him with a sort of childish wonder. Calder's anxious whisper came at his side. "Don't let them get you mad, Dan." Jacqueline, having scored so heavily with her first shot, was by no means willing to give up her sport. "With them big eyes for a starter," she said, "all you need is long hair to be perfect. Do your folks generally let you run around like this?" Every man canted his ear to get the answer, and already they were grinning expectantly. "I don't go out much," returned the soft voice of Dan, "and when I do, I go with my friend here. He takes care of me." Another thunder of laughter broke out. Jacqueline had apparently uncovered a tenderfoot, and a rare one even for that absurd species. A sandy-haired cattle puncher who sat close to Jacqueline now took the cue from the mistress of the house. "Ain't you a bit scared when you get around among real men?" he asked, leering up the table towards Dan. The latter smiled gently upon him. "I reckon maybe I am," he said amiably. "Then you must be shaking in your boots right now," said the other, over the sound of laughter. "No," said Dan, "I feel sort of comfortable." The other replied with a frown that would have intimidated a balky horse. "What do you mean? Ain't you just said men make you sort of nervous?" He imitated the soft drawl of Dan with his last words, and raised another yell of delight from the crowd. Whistlin Dan turned his gentle eyes upon Jacqueline. "Pardon me, ma'am," he began. An instant hush fell on the men. They would not miss one syllable of the delightful remarks of this rarest of all tenderfoots, and the prelude of this coming utterance promised something that would eclipse all that had gone on before. "Talk right out, Brown eyes," said Jacqueline, wiping tears of delight from her eyes. "Talk right out, as if you was a man. I won't hurt you." "I just wanted to ask," said Dan, "if these are real men." The ready laughter started, checked, and died suddenly away. The cattlemen looked at each other in puzzled surprise. "Don't they look like it to you, honey?" asked Jacqueline curiously. Dan allowed his eyes to pass lingeringly around the table from face to face. "I don't know," he said at last. "They look sort of queer to me." "For God's sake, cut this short, Dan," pleaded Tex Calder in an undertone. "Let them have all the rope they want. Don't trip up our party before we get started." "Queer?" echoed Jacqueline, and there was a deep murmur from the men. "Sure," said Dan, smiling upon her again. "They all wear their guns so awfully high." Out of the dead silence broke the roar of the sandy-haired man. "What the hell you mean by that?" Dan leaned forward on one elbow, his right hand free, resting on the edge of the table, but still his smile was almost a caress. "Why," he said, "maybe you can explain it to me. Seems to me that all these guns is wore so high they're more for ornament than use." "You damned pup," began Sandy. He stopped short and stared with a peculiar fascination at Dan, who started to speak again. His voice had changed, not greatly, for its pitch was the same and the drawl was the same, but there was a purr in it that made every man stiffen in his chair and make sure his right hand was free. The ghost of his former smile was still on his lips, but it was his eyes that seemed to fascinate Sandy. "Maybe I'm wrong, partner," he was saying, "and maybe you can prove that your gun ain't just ornamental hardware." What followed was very strange. Sandy was a brave man, and everyone at the table knew it. They waited for the inevitable to happen. They waited for Sandy's lightning move for his gun. They waited for the flash and the crack of the revolver. It did not come. There followed a still more stunning wonder. "You can see," went on that caressing voice of Dan, "that everyone is waiting for you to demonstrate. which the lady is most special interested." And still Sandy did not move that significant right hand. It remained fixed in the air a few inches above the table, the fingers stiffly spread. He moistened his white lips. Then, most strange of all, his eyes shifted and wandered away from the face of Whistling Dan. The others exchanged incredulous glances. The impossible had happened. Sandy had taken water. The sheriff was first to recover, though his forehead was shining with perspiration. "What's all this stuff about?" he called. "Hey, Sandy, quit picking trouble with a stranger." Sandy seized the loophole through which to escape with his honor. He settled back in his chair. "All right, Governor," he said. "I won't go spoiling your furniture. I won't hurt him." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. One trail ends. But this deceived no one. They had seen him palpably take water. A moment of silence followed, while Sandy stared white-faced down at the table, avoiding all eyes. But all the elements of good breeding exist under all the roughness of the West. It was Jacqueline who began with a joke which was rather old, but everyone appreciated it at the moment, and the laughter lasted long enough to restore some of the color to Sandy's face. A general rapid fire of talk followed. "How did you do it?" queried Calder. "I was all prepared for a gunplay." "Why, you seen I didn't do nothing." Then what in the world made Sandy freeze while his hand was on the way to his gun? "I don't know," sighed Dan, "but when I see his hand start moving, I sort of wanted his blood. I wanted him to keep right on till he got hold of his gun. And maybe he seen it in my eyes and that sort of changed his mind." "I haven't the least doubt that it did," said Calder grimly. At the foot of the table Jacqueline's right-hand neighbor was saying, "What happened, Jack?" "Don't ask me," she replied. "All I know is that I don't think any less of Sandy because he backed down. I saw that stranger's face myself, and I'm still sort of weak inside." "How'd he look?" "I don't know. Just hungry. Understand?" She was silent for a time, but she was evidently thinking hard. At last she turned to the same man. "Did you hear Brown Eyes say that the broad-shouldered fella next to him was his friend?" "Sure. I seen 'em ride in together. The other one looks like a hard nut, eh?" She returned no answer, but after a time her eyes raised slowly and rested for a long moment on Dan's face. It was towards the end of the meal, when she rose and went towards the kitchen. At the door she turned, and Dan, though he was looking down at his plate, was conscious that someone was observing him. He glanced up, and the moment his eyes met hers she made a significant backward gesture with her hand. He hesitated a moment and then shoved back his chair. Calder was busy talking to a table mate, so he walked out of the house without speaking to his companion. He went to the rear of the house, and, as he had expected, she was waiting for him. "Brown Eyes," she said swiftly, "that fella who sat beside you, is he your partner?" "I don't know," said Dan evasively. "Why are you asking?" Her breath was coming audibly as if from excitement. "Have you got a fast hoss?" "There ain't no faster." "Believe me, he can't go none too fast with you tonight. Maybe they're after you, too." "Who?" "I can't tell you. Listen to me, Brown Eyes. Go get your horse and feed him the spur till you're 100 miles away, and even then don't stop running." He merely stared at her curiously. She stamped. "Don't stop the talk. If they're after him and you're his partner, they probably want you, too." "I'll stay around. If they're curious about me, I'll tell 'em my name. I'll even spell it for 'em. Who are they?" "They are hell, that's all." "I'd like to see 'em, maybe. They're real men." "They're devils. If I told you their names you'd turn stiff." "I'll take one chance. Tell me who they are." "I don't dare tell you." She hesitated. "I will tell you. You've made a fool out of me with them big baby eyes. Jim Silent is in that house." He turned and ran, but not for the horse shed. He headed straight for the open door of the house. In the dining room, two more had left the table, but the rest, lingering over their fresh-filled coffee cups, sat around telling tales, and Tex Calder was among them. He was about to push back his chair when the hum of talk ceased as if at a command. The men on the opposite side of the table were staring with fascinated eyes at the door, and then a big voice boomed behind him. "Tex Calder, stand up. You've come to the end of the trail." He whirled as he rose, kicking down the chair behind him, and stood face to face with Jim Silent. The great outlaw was scowling, but his gun was in its holster and his hands rested lightly on his hips. It was plain for all eyes to see that he had come not to murder but to fight a fair duel. Behind him loomed the figure of Lee Haynes, scarcely less imposing. All eternity seemed poised and waiting for the second when one of the men would make the move for his gun. Not a breath was drawn in the room. Hands remained frozen in the air in the midst of a gesture. Lips, which had parted to speak, did not close. The steady voice of the clock broke into the silence, a dying space between every tick. For the second time in his life, Tex Calder knew fear. He saw no mere man before him, but his own destiny, and he knew that if he stood before those glaring eyes another minute, he would become like poor Sandy a few minutes before, a white-faced, palsied coward. The shame of the thought gave him power. "Silent," he said, "there's a quick end to the longest trail, because—" His hand darted down. No eye could follow the lightning speed with which he whipped out his revolver and fanned it. But by a mortal fraction of a second, the convulsed jerk of Silent's hand was faster still. Two shots followed. They were rather like one drawn-out report. The woodwork splintered above the outlaw's head. Tex Calder seemed to laugh, but his lips made no sound. He pitched forward on his face. "He fired that bullet," said Silent, "after mine hit him." Then he leaped back through the door. "Keep him back 1 minute, Lee, and then after me," he said as he ran. Haynes stood in the doorway with folded arms. He knew that no one would dare to move a hand. Two doors slammed at the same moment. The front door as Silent leaped into the safety of the night, and the rear door as Whistlin Dan rushed into the house. He stood at the entrance from the kitchen to the dining room, half crouched and swaying from the suddenness with which he had checked his run. He saw the sprawled form of Tex Calder on the floor, and the erect figure of Lee Haynes just opposite him. "For God's sake," screamed Gus Morris, "don't shoot, Haynes. He's done nothing. Let him go." "My life or his," said Haynes savagely. "He's not a man. He's a devil." Dan was laughing low, a sound like a croon. "Tex," he said, "I'm going to take him alive for you." As if in an answer, the dying man stirred on the floor. Haynes went for his gun, a move almost as lightning swift as that of Jim Silent, but now far, far too late. The revolver was hardly clear of its holster when Whistlin Dan's weapon spoke. Haynes, with a curse, clapped his left hand over his wounded right forearm, and then reached after his weapon as it clattered to the floor. Once more he was too late. Dan tossed his gun away with a snarl, like the growl of a wolf, cleared the table at a leap, and was at Haynes' throat. The bandit fought back desperately, vainly. One instant they struggled erect, swaying. The next instant Haynes was lifted bodily and hurled to the floor. He writhed, but under those prisoning hands he was helpless. The sheriff headed the rush for the scene of the struggle, but Dan stopped them. "All you can do," he said, "is to bring me a piece of rope." Jacqueline came running with a stout piece of twine which he twisted around the wrists of Haynes. Then he jerked the outlaw to his feet and stood close, his face inhumanly pale. "If he dies," he said, pointing with a stiff arm back at the prostrate figure of Tex Calder. You'll burn alive for it." The sheriff and two of the other men turned the body of Calder on his back. They tore open his shirt, and Jacqueline leaned over him with a basin of water, trying to wipe away the recurrent blood which trickled down his breast. Dan brushed them away and caught the head of his companion in his arms. "Tex," he moaned. "Tex, open your eyes, partner. I got him for you. I got him alive for you to look at him. Wake up." As if in obedience to the summons, the eyes of Calder opened wide. The lids fluttered as if to clear his vision, but even then his gaze was filmed with a telltale shadow. "Dan, Whistlin Dan," he said, "I'm seeing you a long, long ways off, partner. I'm done for." The whole body of Dan stiffened. "Done? Tex, you can't be. 5 minutes ago you sat at that there table, smilin' and talkin'." "It doesn't take 5 minutes. Half a second can take a man all the way to hell." "If you're goin', pal, if you're goin', Tex, take one comfort along with you. I got the man who killed you. Come here." He pulled the outlaw to his knees beside the dying marshal, whose face had lighted wonderfully. He strained his eyes painfully to make out the face of his slayer. Then he turned his head. He said, "The man who killed me was Jim Silent." Dan groaned and leaned close to Calder. "Then I'll follow him to the end," he began. The feeble accent of Calder interrupted him. "Not that way. Come close to me. I can't hear my own voice, hardly." Dan bowed his head. A whisper murmured on for a moment, broken here and there as Dan nodded his head and said yes. "Then hold up your hand, your right hand," said Calder at last, audibly. Dan obeyed. "You swear it?" "So help me God." "Then here's the pledge of it." Calder fumbled inside his shirt for a moment, and then, withdrawing his hand, placed it palm down in that of Dan. The breath of the marshal was coming in a rattling gasp. He said very faintly, "I've stopped the trails of 20 men. It took the greatest of them all to get me. He got me fair. He beat me to the draw." He stopped as if in awe. "He played square. He's a better man than I, Dan. When you get him, do it the same way, face to face, with time for him to think of hell before he gets there. Partner, I'm going. Wish me luck." "Tex, partner, good luck." It seemed as if that parting wish was granted, for Calder died with a smile. When Dan rose slowly, Gus Morris stepped up and laid a hand on his arm. "Look here, there ain't no use of it being sad for Tex Calder. His business was killing men, and his own time was overdue." Dan turned a face that made Morris wince. "What's the matter?" he asked, with an attempt at bluff good nature. "Do you hate everyone because one man is dead? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll loan you a buckboard and a pair of horses to take Tex back to Elkhead. As for this fella Haynes, I'll take care of him." "I sure need a buckboard," said Dan slowly, "but I'll get a loan from a white man." He turned his back sharply on the sheriff and asked if anyone else had a wagon they could lend him. One of the men had stopped at Morris's place on his way to Elkhead. He immediately proposed that they make the trip together. "All right," said Morris carelessly. "I won't pick trouble with a crazy man. Come with me, Haynes." He turned to leave the room. "Wait," said Dan. Haynes stopped as though someone had seized him by the shoulder. "What the devil is this now?" asked Morris furiously. "Stranger, do you think you can run the world? Come on with me, Haynes." "He stays with me," said Dan. "By God," began Morris, "if I thought—" "This ain't no place for you to begin thinkin'," said the man who had offered his buckboard to Dan. "This fella's made the capture, and he's got a right to take him to Elkhead if he wants. There's a reward on the head of Lee Haynes." "The arrest is made in my county," said Morris stoutly, "and I've got the say as to what's to be done with a prisoner." "Morris," said Haynes earnestly, "if I'm taken to Elkhead it'll simply be a matter of lynchin'. You know the crowd in that town." "Right, right," said Morris, eagerly picking up the word. It'd be plain lynching, murder." Dan broke in. "Haynes, step over here behind me." For one instant Haynes hesitated and then obeyed silently. "This is contempt of the law and an officer of the law," said Morris. "And I'll see that you get fined so that—" "Better cut it short there, Sheriff," said one of the men. "I wouldn't go calling the attention of folks to the way Jim Silent walked into your house and made his getaway without you trying to raise a hand. Law or no law, I'm with this stranger." "Me too," said another. "Any man who could fan a gun like him doesn't need no law." The sheriff saw that the tide of opinion had set strongly against him and abandoned his position with speed, if not with grace. Dan ordered Haynes to walk before him outside the house. They faced each other in the dim moonlight. "I've got one question to ask you," he said. "Make it short," said Haynes calmly. "I've got to do my talking before the lynching crowd." "You can answer it in one word. Does Kate Cumberland, what is she to you?" Lee Haynes set his teeth. "All the world," he said. Even in the dim light he saw the yellow glow of Dan's eyes, and he felt as if a wolf stood there trembling with eagerness to leap at his throat. "And what are you to her?" "Nothing more than dirt under her feet." "Haynes, you lie." "I'll tell you that if she cares for me as much as she does for the horse she rides on, I'd let the whole world know if I had to die for it the next moment." "Truth has a ring of its own." "Haynes, if I could hear that from her own lips, I'd let you go free. If you'll show me the way to Kate, I'll set you loose the minute I see her." "I can't do it. I've given my faith to Silent and his men. Where she is, they are." "Haynes, that means death for you." "I know it." Another plan had come to Dan as they talked. He took Haynes inside again, and coming out once more, whistled for Bart. The wolf appeared as if by magic through the dark. He took out Kate's glove, which the wolf had brought him in the willows, and allowed him to smell it. Bart whined eagerly. If he had that glove he would range the hills until he found its owner, directed to her by that strange instinct of the wild things. If Kate still loved him, the glove would be more eloquent than 1,000 messages. And if she managed to escape, the wolf would guide her back to his master. He sat on his heels, caught the wolf on either side of his shaggy head, and stared into the glow of the yellow-green eyes. It was as if the man were speaking to the wolf. At last, as if satisfied, he drew a deep breath, rose, and dropped the glove. It was caught in the flashing teeth. For another moment Bart stood whining and staring up to the face of his master. Then he whirled and fled out into the night. End of chapter 20. #21 of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. One Way Out. In a room of the Salton place, on the evening of the next day after Calder's death, sat Silent with Kilduff, Rhinehart, and Jordan about him. Purvis was out scouting for the news of Haynes, whose long absence commenced to worry the gang. Several times they tried to induce Kate to come out and talk with them, but she was resolute in staying alone in the room which they had assigned to her. Consequently, to while away the time, Bill Kilduff produced his mouth organ and commenced a dolorous ballad. He broke short in the midst of it and stared at the door. The others followed the direction of his eyes and saw Black Bart standing framed against the fading daylight. They started up with curses. Rhinehart drew his gun. "Wait a minute," ordered Silent. "Damn it," exclaimed Jordan. "Don't you see Whistlin Dan's wolf? If the wolf's here, Dan isn't far behind." Silent shook his head. "If there's going to be any shooting of that wolf, leave it to Hal Purvis. He just naturally set his heart on it. And Whistlin Dan ain't with the wolf. Look, there's a woman's glove hanging out of his mouth. He picked that up in the willows, maybe, and followed the girl here. Watch him." The wolf slunk across the room to the door which opened on Kate's apartment. Kate threw the door open, cried out at the sight of Bart, and then snatched up the glove he let drop at her feet. "No cause for getting excited," said Silent. "Whistlin' Dan ain't comin' here after the wolf." For answer she slammed the door. At the same moment Hal Purvis entered. He stepped directly to Silent and stood facing him with his hands resting on his hips. His smile was marvellously unpleasant. "Well," said the chief, "what's the news? You've got eloquent eyes, Hal, but I want words." "The news is plain hell," said Purvis. "Haynes." "What of him?" "He's in Elkhead." "Elkhead?" "Whistlin' Dan got him at Morris's place and took him along with the body of Tex Calder. Jim, you've got to answer for it to all of us. You went to Morris's with Lee. You come away without him and let him stay behind to be nabbed by that devil Whistlin' Dan." "Right," said Kilduff, and his teeth clicked. "Is that playin' fair?" "Boys," said Silent solemnly, "if I'd known that Whistlin' Dan was there I'd of never left Haynes to stay behind. Morris said nothin' about Calder havin' a runnin' mate. Me and Haynes was in the upstairs room at about supper time. Up came a feller and told us that Tex Calder had just come into the dinin' room. That was all. Did Whistlin' Dan get Lee from behind?" "He got him from the front. He beat Lee to the draw so bad that Haynes hardly got his gun out of its leather." "The feller that told you that lied," said Silent. "Haynes is as fast with his shootin' iron as I am, almost." The rest of the outlaws nodded to each other significantly. Purvis went on without heeding the interruption. "After I found out about the fight I swung towards Elkhead. About 5 miles out of town I met up with Rogers, the deputy sheriff at Elkhead. I thought you had him fixed for us, Jim." "Damn his hide, I did. Is he playin' us dirt now?" "A frosty morning in December was nothing to the way he talked." "Cut all that short," said Rhinehart, "and let's know if Rogers is going to be able to keep the lynchin' party away from Haynes." "He says he thinks it can be done for a couple of days," said Purvis, "but the whole range is risin'. All the punchers are ridin' into Elkhead and wantin' to take a look at the famous Lee Haynes. Rogers says that when enough of them get together they'll take the law into their own hands and nothin' can stop 'em then." "Why don't that rotten dog give Haynes a chance to make a getaway?" asked Silent. "Ain't we paid him his share ever since we started workin' these parts?" "He didn't dare take the chance," said Purvis. "He says the boys are talkin' mighty strong. They want action. They've put up a guard all around the jail, and they say that if Haynes gets loose they'll string up Rogers." "Everyone's wild about the killin' of Calder, Jim. Old Saunderson, he put up $5,000 out of his own pocket to raise the price on your head." "And this Whistlin' Dan," said Silent, "I suppose they're making a hero out of him." "Rogers says that every man within 10 miles is talking about him. The whole range'll know of him in 2 days. He made a nice play when he got in. You know they's $5,000 out on Haynes' head. It was offered to him by Rogers as soon as Dan brought Lee in. What d'you think he done? Pocketed the check? No, he grabbed it and tore it up small. 'I ain't after no blood money,' he says." "No," said Silent, "he ain't after no money. He's after me." "Tomorrow they bury Calder. The next day Whistlin' Dan'll be on our trail again, and he'll be playin' the same lone hand. Rogers offered him a posse. He wouldn't take it." "They's one point that ain't no nearer being solved," said Bill Kilduff in a growl, "and that's how you're goin' to get Haynes loose. Silent, it's up to you. Which you rode away leaving him behind." Silent took one glance around the waiting circle. Then he nodded. "It's up to me. Give me a chance to think." He started walking up and down the room, muttering. At last he stopped short. "Boys, it can be done. There's nothin' like talkin' of a woman to make a man turn himself into a plumb fool, and I'm goin' to make a fool out of Whistlin' Dan with this girl Kate." "But how in the name of God can you make her go out and talk to him?" said Rhinehart. "Son," answered Silent, "there's just one main trouble with you. You talk a hell of a pile too much. When I've done this I'll tell you how it was figured out." End of chapter 21. 22 of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman's Way. It was a day later in the morning that a hand knocked at Kate's door, and she opened it to Jim Silent. He entered, brushing off the dust of a long journey. "Good morning, Miss Cumberland." He extended a hand which she overlooked. "You still busy hating me?" "I'm simply surprised that you have come in here to talk to me." "You look as if you'd seen something in my face," he said suspiciously. "What is it, dirt?" He brushed a hand across his forehead. "Whatever it is," she answered, "you can't rub it away." "I'm thinking of giving you a leave of absence, if you'll promise to come back." "Would you trust my honor?" "In a pinch like this," he said amiably, "I would. But here's my business. Lee Haynes is jailed in Elkhead. The man that put him behind the bars and the only one that can take him out again is Whistlin Dan, and the one person who can make Dan set Lee loose is you. Savvy? Will you go and talk with Dan? This wolf of his would find him for you." She shook her head. "Why not?" cried Silent in a rising voice. "The last time he saw me," she said, "he had reason to think that I tried to betray him because of Lee Haynes. If I went to him now to plead for Haynes, he'd be sure that I was what he called me, Delilah." "Is that final?" "Absolutely." "Now get me straight. There's a crowd of cowpunchers gathering in Elkhead, and today or tomorrow they'll be strong enough to take the law into their own hands and organize a little lynching bee. Savvy?" She shuddered. "It ain't pleasant, is it? The picture of big, good-looking Lee dangling from the end of a rope with the crowd around taking pop shots at him. No, it ain't, and you're going to stop it. You're going to start from here in 15 minutes with your hoss and this wolf, after giving me your promise to come back when you've seen Whistlin Dan. You're going to make Dan go and set Lee loose." She smiled in derision. "If Dan did that, he'd be outlawed." "You won't stir?" "Not a step." "Well, kid, for everything that happens to Lee, something worse will happen to someone in the next room. Maybe you'd like to see him." He opened the door and she stepped into the entrance. Almost opposite her sat old Joe Cumberland, with his hands tied securely behind his back. At sight of her, he rose with a low cry. She turned on Big Silent and whipped the 6-gun from his hip. He barely managed to grasp her wrist and swing the heavy revolver out of line with his body. "You little fiend," he snarled. "Drop the gun or I'll wring your neck." "I don't fear you," she said, never wincing under the crushing grip on her wrist. "You murderer," he said, calmly repossessing himself of his gun. "Now take a long look at your father and repeat all the things you was just saying to me." She stared miserably at her father. When Silent caught Kate's hand, Cumberland had started forward, but Kilduff and Rhinehart held him. "What is it, Kate?" he cried. "What does it mean?" She explained it briefly. "This is Jim Silent." He remained staring at her with open mouth, as if his brain refused to admit what his ear heard. "There ain't no use asking questions how and why she's here," said Silent. "This is the point. Lee Haynes is behind the bars in Elkhead. Whistlin Dan put him there, and maybe the girl can persuade Dan to bring him out again. If she don't, then everything that lynchin' gang does to Haynes we're going to do to you. Get down on your knees, Cumberland, and beg your daughter to save your hide." The head of Kate dropped down. "Untie his hands," she said. "I'll talk with Dan." "I knew you'd see reason," grinned Silent. "Just 1 minute," said Cumberland. "Kate, is Lee Haynes one of Silent's gang?" "He is." "And Dan put him behind bars?" "Yes." "If Dan takes him out again, the boy'll be outlawed, Kate." "Cumberland," broke in Kilduff savagely, "here's your call to stop thinking about Whistlin Dan and begin figuring for yourself." "Don't you see?" said Kate. "It's your death these cowards mean." Cumberland seemed to grow taller. He stood so stiffly erect, with his chin high like a soldier. "You shan't make no single step to talk with Dan." "Can't you understand that it's you they threaten?" she cried. "I understand it all," he said evenly. I'm too old to have a young man damned for my sake." "Shut him up," ordered Silent. "The old fool." The heavy hand of Terry Jordan clapped over Joe's mouth effectually silenced him. He struggled vainly to speak again, and Kate turned to Silent to shut out the sight. "Tell your man to let him go," she said. "I will do what you wish." "That's talkin' sense," said Silent. "Come out with me and I'll saddle your hoss. Call the wolf." He opened the door, and in response to her whistle, Black Bart trotted out and followed them out to the horse shed. There the outlaw quickly saddled Kate's pony. He said, "Whistlin Dan is sure headin' back in this direction because he's got an idea I'm somewhere near. Bart will find him on the way." Silent was right. That morning Dan had started back towards Gus Morris's place, for he was sure that the outlaws were camped in that neighborhood. A little before noon he veered half a mile to the right towards a spring which welled out from the hillside, surrounded by a small grove of willows. Having found it, he drank and watered Satan, then took off the saddle to ease the stallion, and lay down at a little distance for a 10-minute siesta, one of those half-wakeful sleeps, the habit of which he had learned from his wolf. He was roused from the doze by a tremendous snorting and snarling, and found Black Bart playing with Satan. It was their greeting after an absence, and they dashed about among the willows like creatures possessed. Dan brought horse and dog to a motionless stand with a single whistle, and then ran out to the edge of the willows. Down the side of the hill rode Kate at a brisk gallop. In a moment she saw him and called his name with a welcoming wave of her arm. Now she was off her horse and running to him. He caught her hands and held her for an instant far from him, like one striving to draw out the note of happiness into a song. They could not speak. "At last. I knew you'd find a way to come." "They let me go, Dan." He frowned, and her eyes faltered from his. "They sent me to ask you to free Lee Haynes." He dropped her hands, and she stood trying to find words to explain, and finding none. "To free Haynes?" he repeated heavily. "It is Dad!" she cried. "They have captured him, and they are holding him. They keep him in exchange for Haynes." "If I free Haynes they'll outlaw me. You know that, Kate." She made a pace towards him, but he retreated. "What can I do?" she pleaded desperately. "It is for my father." His face brightened as he caught at a new hope. "Show me the way to Silent's hiding place, and I'll free your father and reach the end of this trail at the same time, Kate." She blanched pitifully. It was hopeless to explain. "Dan, honey, I can't." She watched him miserably. "I've given them my word to come back alone." His head bowed. Out of the willows came Satan and Black Bart and stood beside him, the stallion nosing his shoulder affectionately. "Dan, dear, won't you speak to me? Won't you tell me that you try to understand?" He said at last, "Yes, I'll free Lee Haynes." The fingers of his right hand trailed slowly across the head of Black Bart. His eyes raised and looked past her far across the running curves of the hills, far away to the misty horizon. "Kate." "Dan, do you understand?" "I didn't know a woman could love a man the way you do Lee Haynes. When I send him back to you, tell him to watch himself. I'm playing your game now, but if I meet him afterwards I'll play my own." All she could say was, "Will you listen to me no more, Dan?" "Here's where we say good-bye." He took her hand, and his eyes were as unfathomable as a midnight sky. She turned to her horse, and he helped her to the saddle with a steady hand. That was all. He went back to the willows, his right arm resting on the withers of black Satan as if upon the shoulder of a friend. As she reached the top of the hill she heard a whistling from the willows, a haunting complaint which brought the tears to her eyes. She spurred her tired horse to escape the sound. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hell starts. Between twilight and dark, Whistling Dan entered Elkhead. He rose in the stirrups on his toes, stretching the muscles of his legs. He was sensing his strength. So the pianist, before he plays, runs his fingers up and down the keys and sees that all is in tune and the touch perfect. Two rival saloons faced each other at the end of the single street. At the other extremity of the lane stood the house of Deputy Sheriff Rogers, and a little farther was the jail. A crowd of horses stood in front of each saloon, but from the throngs within there came hardly a sound. The hush was prophetic of action. It was the lull before the storm. Dan slowed his horse as he went farther down the street. The shadowy figure of a rider showed near the jail. He narrowed his eyes and looked more closely. Another horseman showed. 4 in sight on his side of the jail, and probably as many more out of his vision. 8 cattlemen guarded the place from which he must take Lee Haynes, and every one of the 8, he had no doubt, was a picked man. Dan pulled up Satan to a walk and commenced to whistle softly. It was like one of those sounds of the wind, a thing to guess at rather than to know, but the effect upon Satan and Black Bart was startling. The ears of the stallion dropped flat on his neck. He began to slink along with a gliding step which was very like the stealthy pace of Black Bart, stealing ahead. His footfall was as silent as if he had been shod with felt. Meantime, Dan ran over a plan of action. He saw very clearly that he had little time for action. Those motionless guards around the jail made his task difficult enough, but there was a still greater danger. The crowds in the 2 saloons would be starting up the street for Haynes before long. Their silence told him that. A clatter of hoofs came behind him. He did not turn his head, but his hand dropped down to his revolver butt. The fast-riding horseman swept and shot on down the street, leaving a pungent though invisible cloud of dust behind him. He stopped in front of Rogers' house and darted up the steps and through the door. Acting on a premonition, Dan dismounted a short distance from Rogers' house and ran to the door. He opened it softly and found himself in a narrow hall dimly lighted by a smoking lamp. Voices came from the room to his right. "What do you mean, Hardy?" the deputy sheriff was saying. "Hell's startin'. There's a good many kinds of hell. Come out with it, Lee. I ain't no mind reader. They're getting ready for the big bust." "What big bust? It ain't no use bluffin'. Ain't Silent told you that I'm on the inside of the game?" "You fool!" cried Rogers. "Don't use that name." Dan slipped a couple of paces down the hall and flattened himself against the wall just as the door opened. Rogers looked out, drew a great breath of relief, and went back into the room. Dan resumed his former position. "Now talk fast," said Rogers. "About time for you to drop that rotten bluff. Why, man, I could even tell you just how much you've cost Jim Silent." Rogers growled. "Tell me what's up." "The boys are going for the jail tonight. They'll get out Haynes and string him up. It's coming to him. He's played a hard game for a long time. And so have you, Rogers, for a damn long time." Rogers swallowed the insult, apparently. "What can I do?" he asked plaintively. "I'm willing to give Silent and his gang a square deal." "You should have done something while there was only a half a dozen cowpunchers in town. Now the town's full of riders, and they're all after blood." "And my blood if they don't get Haynes," broke in the deputy sheriff. Hardy grunted. "They sure are," he said. "I've heard 'em talk, and they mean business, all of 'em. But how would you answer to Jim Silent, Rogers, if you let 'em get Haynes? Well, Haynes is Silent's partner, and Jim'll bust everything wide to get even with you." "I can explain," said Rogers huskily. "I can show Silent how I'm helpless." Footsteps went up and down the room. "If they start anything," said Rogers, "I'll mark down the names of the ringleaders, and I'll give 'em hell afterwards. That'll soothe Jim some." "You won't know 'em. They'll wear masks." Dan opened the door and stepped into the room. Rogers started up with a curse and gripped his revolver. "I never knew you was so fond of gunplay," said Dan. Maybe that gun of yours would be catching cold if you was to leave it out of the leather long." The sheriff restored his revolver slowly to the holster, glowering. "And Rogers won't be needing you for a minute or two," went on Dan to Hardy. They seemed to fear even his voice. The Wells Fargo agent vanished through the door and clattered down the steps. "How long you been standing at that door?" said Rogers, gnawing at his lips. "Just for a breathing space," said Dan. Rogers squinted his eyes to make up for the dimness of the lamplight. "By God," he cried suddenly, "you're Whistlin Dan Berry!" He dropped into his chair and passed a trembling hand across his forehead. He stammered, "Maybe you've changed your mind and come back for that $5,000. "No, I've come for a man, not for money." "A man?" "I want Lee Haynes before the crowd gets him." "Would you really try to take Haynes out?" asked Rogers with a touch of awe. "Are there any guards in the jail?" "Two, Lewis and Patterson." "Give me a written order for Haynes." The deputy wavered. "If I do that I'm done for in this town." "Maybe. I want the key for Haynes's handcuffs." "Go over and put your hoss up in the shed behind the jail," said Rogers, fighting for time, "and when you come back I'll have the order written out and give it to you with the key." "Why not come over with me now?" "I've got some other business." "In 5 minutes I'll be back," said Dan, and left the house. Outside he whistled to Satan, and the stallion trotted up to him. He swung into the saddle and rode to the jail. There was not a guard in sight. He rode around to the other side of the building to reach the stable. Still he could not sight one of the shadowy horsemen who had surrounded the place a few minutes before. Perhaps the crowd had called in the guards to join the attack. He put Satan away in the stable, and as he led him into his stall he heard a roar of many voices far away. Then came the crack of a half-dozen revolvers. Dan set his teeth and glanced quickly over the half-dozen horses in the little shed. He recognized the tall bay of Lee Haynes at once, and threw on its back the saddle which hung on a peg directly behind it. As he drew up the cinch another shout came from the street, but this time very close. When he raced around the jail he saw the crowd pouring into the house of the deputy sheriff. He ran on till he came to the outskirts of the mob. Every man was masked, but in the excitement no one noticed that Dan's face was bare. Squirming his way through the press, Dan reached the deputy's office. It was almost filled. Rogers stood on a chair trying to argue with the cattleman. "No more talk, Sheriff," thundered one among the cowpunchers. "We've had enough of your line of talk. Now we want some action of our own brand. For the last time, are you going to order Lewis and Patterson to give up Haynes, or are you going to let two good men die fighting for a damn lone rider?" "What about the fellow who's going to take Lee Haynes out of Elkhead?" cried another. The crowd yelled with delight. "Yes, where is he? What about him?" Rogers, glancing down from his position on the chair, stared into the brown eyes of Whistlin Dan. He stretched out an arm that shook with excitement. "That fellow there," he cried, "the one without a mask. Whistlin Dan Berry is the man." End of chapter 23. Of the Untamed by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Rescue. The throng gave back from Dan as if from the vicinity of a panther. Dan faced the circle of scowling faces, smiling gently upon them. "Look here, Barry," called a voice from the rear of the crowd. "Why do you want to take Haynes away? Throw in your cards with us. We need you." "If it's fighting you want," cried a joker, "maybe Lewis and Patterson will give us all enough of it at the jail." "I ain't never hunting for trouble," said Dan. "Make you play quick," said another. "We've got no time to waste, even on Dan Barry. Speak out, Dan. Here's a lot of good fellows aiming to take out Haynes and give him what's due him. No more. Are you with us?" "I'm not." "Is that final?" "It is." "All right, tie 'em up, boys. There ain't no other way." "Look out!" shouted a score of voices. for a gun flashed in Dan's hand. He aimed at no human target. The bullet shattered the glass lamp into 1,000 shivering and tinkling splinters. Thick darkness blotted the room. Instantly thereafter, a blow, a groan, and the fall of a body, then a confused clamor. "He's here! Give up that gun, damn you! You got the wrong man. I'm Bill Flynn. Guard the door. Lights, for God's sakes! Help!" A slender figure leaped up against the window and was dimly outlined by the starlight outside. There was a crash of falling glass, and as 2 or 3 guns exploded, the figure leaped down outside the house. "Follow him!" "Who was that?" "Get a light! Who's got a match?" Half the men rushed out of the room to pursue the fleeing figure. The other half remained to see what had happened. It seemed impossible that Whistling Dan had escaped from their midst. Half a dozen sulphur matches spurted little jets of blue flame and discovered 4 men lying prone on the floor, most of them with the wind trampled from their bodies, but otherwise unhurt. One of them was the sheriff. He lay with his shoulders propped against the wall. His mouth was a mass of blood. "Who got you, Rogers? Where's Berry?" The jail," groaned Rogers. "Berry has gone for the jail." Revolvers rattled outside. "He's gone for Haynes," screamed the deputy. "Go get him, boys." "How can he get Haynes? He ain't got the keys." "He has, you fools. When he shot the lights out, he jumped for me and knocked me off the chair. Then he went through my pockets and got the keys. Get on your way, quick." The lynchers, yelling with rage, were already stamping from the room. With the jangling bunch of keys in one hand and his revolver in the other, Dan started full speed for the jail as soon as he leaped down from the window. By the time he had covered half the intervening distance, the first pursuers burst out of Rogers' house and opened fire after the shadowy fugitive. He whirled and fired 3 shots high in the air. No matter how impetuous, those warning shots would make the mob approach the jail with some caution. On the door of the jail he beat furiously with the bunch of keys. "What's up? Who's there?" cried a voice within. "Message from Rogers. Hell's started. He sent me with the keys." The door jerked open and a tall man, with a rifle slung across one arm, blocked the entrance. "What's the message?" he asked. "This," said Dan, and drove his fist squarely into the other's face. He fell without a cry and floundered on the floor, gasping. Dan picked him up and shoved him through the door, bolting it behind him. A narrow hall opened before him and ran the length of the small building. He glanced into the room on one side. It was the kitchen and eating room in one. He rushed into the one on the other side. 2 men were there. One was Haynes, sitting with his hands manacled. The other was the second guard, who ran for Dan, whipping his rifle to his shoulder. As flame spurted from the mouth of the gun, Dan dived at the man's knees and brought him to the floor with a crash. He rose quickly and leaned over the fallen man, who lay without moving, his arms spread wide. He had struck on his forehead when he dropped. He was stunned for the moment, but not seriously hurt. Dan ran to Haynes, who stood with his hands high above his head. Far away was the shout of the coming crowd. "Shoot and be damned," said Haynes sullenly. For answer, Dan jerked down the hands of the lone rider and commenced to try the keys on the handcuffs. There were 4 keys. The 4th turned the lock. Haynes shouted as his hands fell free. "After me," cried Dan, and raced for the stable. As they swung into their saddles outside the shed, the lynchers raced their horses around the jail. "Straight away," called Dan. "Through the cottonwoods and down the lane. After me. Satan!" The stallion leaped into a full gallop, heading straight for a tall group of cottonwoods beyond which was a lane fenced in with barbed wire. Half a dozen of the pursuers were in a position to cut them off, and now rushed for the cottonwoods, yelling to their comrades to join them. A score of lights flashed like giant fireflies as the lynchers opened fire. "They've blocked the way," groaned Haynes. 3 men had brought their horses to a sliding stop in front of the cottonwoods, and their revolvers cracked straight in the faces of Dan and Haynes. There was no other way for escape. Dan raised his revolver and fired twice, aiming low. Two of the horses reared and pitched to the ground. The third rider had a rifle at his shoulder. He was holding his fire until he had drawn a careful bead. Now his gun spurted, and Dan bowed far over his saddle as if he had been struck from behind. Before the rifleman could fire again, Black Bart leaped high in the air. His teeth closed on the shoulder of the lyncher, and the man catapulted from his saddle to the ground. With his yell in their ears, Dan and Haynes galloped through the cottonwoods and swept down the lane. End of chapter 24.